All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really going to try to unpack one of the recommendations in the Forged Act and how it could change the way the DoD acquires, well, pretty much everything.
Absolutely. We're calling this a deep dive for a reason. We're going deep on this one. This is about getting down into the nuts and bolts of Section 315 of the Forged Act, the part they're calling non-traditional defense contractor commercial solutions opening, and figuring out what it all means, for people like our listeners.
Exactly. So that's the mission today, to really understand what they're trying to do with this section, how it could all play out, and what you might want to think about in terms of how to prepare for it.
And to be totally transparent as we go through this, it's super important to remember that, some of the things we'll talk about, like the mitigations and the measures of success, those are all suggested by the reviewer, not like set in stone. And the same goes for the alternative approaches. Those are labeled as potential alternative approaches in the Act. So just keep that in mind as we dig in.
For sure. And just a reminder that this deep dive is part of a bigger series we're doing on the Forged Act. So if you haven't listened to the others, definitely go check those out. But for now, let's jump right into Section 315. So what's the big idea here? What are they even talking about?
Well, this section at its core is all about changing up Title 10 of the U.S. Code, specifically Section 3458. And the heart of this change is about setting up these groups, they call them consortia, made up of completely non-traditional defense contractors.
Non-traditional. So, okay, for someone who doesn't live and breathe DoD acronyms, what kind of companies are we talking about here? Paint a picture for us.
Yeah, so, non-traditional defense contractors, they call them NDCs for short. These are basically companies that historically haven't really been the big players in selling directly to the DoD. They're the ones coming in with new technologies and ideas, often from the commercial world, like those Silicon Valley startups or smaller tech firms that you hear about.
Right, companies that might not have ever even thought about navigating the whole, DoD contracting process. So these NDC consortia, what's the point of creating them? What's the big picture?
The idea is to have these consortia actually work on building prototypes, early versions of new technologies, and even potentially moving into production too. And a huge piece of how they're talking about doing this is through something called Other Transaction Authority, OT Authority for short.
OT authority. I think we've mentioned it before, but for our listeners who are hearing this for the first time, why is that such a big deal when we're talking about getting these newer companies involved?
You have to think of OT authority as sort of a more flexible way for the DoD to work with companies. It's not like a traditional contract, which can be, let's be honest, really rigid and full of rules and regulations. OTs, they're a lot more adaptable and can be more tailored to these kind of innovative projects, which makes a huge difference when you're working with companies that aren't used to all the ins and outs of how the DoD usually does things. It's all about being faster, more agile, getting those innovations in quicker.
I see, cutting through some of that red tape. So this whole concept of bringing in non-traditional contractors like this, and specifically through these consortia, it didn't just pop up overnight, right? There's got to be some history here.
Oh, for sure. This has been brewing for a while now. You can even trace it back to the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA. That's actually where they first formally defined what a non-traditional defense contractor even is. And that same NDAA also started expanding the use of what they call commercial solutions openings, CSOs for short. And the goal then, just like now, was to tap into all that cool innovation happening in the commercial world.
Makes sense. And I'm guessing that somewhere along the way, they realized those initial efforts just weren't quite cutting it. That's what led to this new push with Section 315.
Yeah, you got it. So there was this growing concern, right, that the DOB's traditional buying process was actually making it really hard for these non-traditional companies to get involved. There were these reports from the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. There were like an independent programs and analogies from, those folks over at crsreports.congress.gov. And they were all pointing out that the way the DoD buys stuff, with all the bureaucracy and complexity, it was like a giant roadblock for these more agile, commercial-minded companies. And the worry was that the DoD was missing out on a lot of potentially game-changing tech because of it.
So all that red tape was actually slowing down innovation instead of speeding it up.
Exactly. And then a couple of years later, in the 2018 NDAA, they broadened the use of that OT authority we talked about. You can actually see that documented over at history.defense.gov. That was a pretty clear sign that they wanted to move towards a more agile acquisition process. And at the same time, studies from the Defense Science Board, you can find those on their website, dsb.tito.mile, and critiques from places like innovation.defense.gov, they were all saying that NDCs had huge potential, but that the existing CSOs and the way consortia were being used just weren't really cutting it. You can even find some of that analysis over at discover.ddt.mile if you want to dig deeper.
So is it fair to say that Section 315 is basically trying to fix all those problems they identified, like the next step in this whole evolution of bringing in non-traditional companies?
Exactly. Section 315 of Senate Bill 5618, the one Senator Roger Wicker introduced back in December 2024, it takes all that work, all those lessons learned, and builds on them. It's like, okay, we need these consortia, and they have to be just for NDCs, and then it ties it all into the DoD's adaptive acquisition framework, which you can find spelled out in DoDI 5000.2. It's a really clear sign that they're serious about finding better ways to bring these innovators into the mix.
Okay, so the why is pretty clear, faster innovation, right? But let's get specific. What are the actual benefits the DoD thinks it's going to get from doing things the way Section 315 lays it out?
So they lay out 5 big desired effects in the Act. The first one is all about fostering collaboration. By creating these NDC consortia, the hope is that they'll start working together more, specifically on developing those prototype technologies.
Okay, so get them talking to each other, sharing ideas. What's the second benefit they're hoping for?
The second one is about making things smoother, creating a more seamless link between those commercial solutions openings and using OT authority. The idea is to make it easier to go from developing a prototype under a CSO to actually producing it using a more flexible OT agreement, basically making the path from good idea to reality a lot less bumpy.
It's all about streamlining, making things faster and more efficient. All right, what's the third desired effect they list?
So the third one, this is interesting. They're specifically saying that these consortia can only be for non-traditional defense contractors. It's not an accident. It's a very deliberate choice to really prioritize those agile, non-traditional companies we've been talking about.
So this is like a really targeted effort, not just opening the doors to everyone. Got it. And what's number 4 on their list of benefits?
The fourth one is about using those agile acquisition pathways more often, things like the middle tier of acquisition. For folks listening who might not be familiar, the middle tier is designed to be this faster route for getting prototypes built and new capabilities fielded, way faster than the traditional super long acquisition programs. It's all about speed, getting those new tools and technologies into the hands of the people who need them quicker.
Faster is usually better, especially when it comes to national security, right? All right, what's the final big picture benefit they're aiming for with all of this?
The fifth one, the big one, really sums it all up. It's about making it way easier for the DoD to get their hands on all those cutting-edge technologies and solutions that are out there in the commercial world, stuff that they might not even know about or be able to get easily through the traditional buying process. It's about expanding their horizons and tapping into a much wider pool of innovation.
Okay, so on the surface, this all sounds, pretty amazing, but we all know that even with the best of intentions, things don't always go as planned. So are there any potential downsides here? What could go wrong with this whole approach?
It's really important to look at both sides of the coin, and luckily, the Forged Act does a pretty good job of outlining some potential negative impacts. The first one they highlight is the risk of leaving traditional defense contractors out in the cold. These bigger, more established companies, they often have a ton of expertise and can produce things more cheaply because of their scale. So if you cut them out completely, there's a chance you end up with less competition, which could actually drive prices up for the DoD.
Yeah, those established players have been around for a reason. There's a lot of institutional knowledge there. What's another potential downside they've identified?
Another big one is that by focusing solely on NDCs, you might end up limiting the expertise that's available for certain projects. While these non-traditional companies bring a lot of fresh ideas, they might not have the deep knowledge or experience in certain really critical areas specific to defense, and that could mean a higher risk of projects failing.
Right. Expertise and experience are definitely crucial in this world. What about this whole emphasis on faster, more agile pathways? Could that backfire in any way?
Yeah, that's the third potential negative impact they're talking about. While being fast is great, there's a concern that if they're too focused on speed, they might start cutting corners when it comes to really rigorous testing and evaluation. And that's super important for making sure that whatever systems they're putting out there are actually reliable and safe.
I mean, you definitely don't want to be rushing something critical and then have it fail when you need it most. What else is on their list of potential downsides?
The fourth one is about the nuts and bolts of managing all these new consortia, setting them up, keeping them running smoothly, and making sure they're actually meeting the DoD's needs. All that takes a lot of work and resources, and if it's not handled well, it could actually end up bogging things down even more, causing delays and headaches.
So it's almost like creating more bureaucracy to manage the existing bureaucracy? Not ideal. What's the final potential negative impact they highlight?
The last one they mention is about being careful not to go too far in the other direction. While NDCs bring a lot to the table, if the DoD becomes too reliant on them and starts neglecting the traditional companies, they might miss out on some really solid, proven solutions in certain areas. It's about finding the right balance, not just swapping one for the other.
It's fascinating to see all these potential pitfalls laid out like that. So knowing all that, what are they proposing to do about it? What solutions are on the table?
So there's a whole section in the Act called Mitigations the Organization Will Take to Diminish the Negative Impacts. Again, it's important to remember these are just suggestions from the reviewer. To deal with that first concern about leaving traditional contractors out, one idea is to have open competitions alongside these NDC-only consortia every once in a while. That way, the traditional companies can still get a shot at bidding on projects.
Yeah, it seems like a good way to keep things fair and make sure they don't lose access to that valuable experience. How about that second concern about potentially not having enough expertise within the NDC consortia?
To handle that one, the suggestion is to actually make it a requirement for NDCs participating in these consortia to partner up with more experienced subcontractors. Those subcontractors can bring that deeper knowledge and experience that the NDCs might be missing, especially when it comes to the specifics of defense work. It's about combining the best of both worlds, the fresh ideas with the seasoned know-how.
I like that. Sort of a team effort, each bringing their strengths to the table. What about that worry that they might start skipping important testing steps with these faster acquisition pathways?
Well, for that one, the idea is to make sure there are still minimum standards that have to be met, even within those agile pathways. That way, even though the process is moving faster, there's still a baseline level of testing and evaluation to ensure that the end product is actually good and reliable.
So speed doesn't mean cutting corners on the stuff that really matters. All right, what about that potential resource strain from managing all these new consortia? Any ideas on how to address that?
The proposal for that one is to actually dedicate specific staff to oversee the operations of all these consortia. Having a team focus solely on that, hopefully, will prevent things from getting bogged down and ensure that the consortia are running smoothly and achieving their goals.
Okay, so dedicated oversight to keep things moving. Makes sense. And lastly, how about that risk of becoming too reliant on NDCs and forgetting about the traditional contractors?
The idea there is to really try to strike a balance, to make sure the DoD is doing projects with both NDC consortia and traditional contractors. That way they can keep benefiting from the strengths of both sides, not just switching from one extreme to the other.
That's interesting how they've tried to think through all the potential pitfalls and come up with solutions. Now, switching gears a little bit for our listeners out there, especially those who work in or around the defense world, if this Section 315 actually happens, who in the DoD is going to be most affected?
Oh, this is going to touch a lot of people, but there are a few key roles that will really feel it. First, you've got those leaders in the systems commands and those folks called portfolio acquisition executives. They're going to be the ones setting up and managing these NDC consortia, so they're going to have a lot more on their plates. Then you've got the contracting officers. Those are the folks who actually handle the agreements. They're going to need to get really good at working with OTs and CSOs, which are a bit different from traditional contracts, and they'll need to know how to work with these non-traditional companies. And then more broadly, everyone involved in the acquisition process is going to need to adapt to these more actual ways of doing things. So if you're in any of those roles, this is definitely something to keep an eye on and start thinking about how it might change your day-to-day.
And it's not just folks within the DoD, right? Are there any groups outside the Pentagon who might be a little, shall we say, less than thrilled about this whole thing?
Yeah, definitely. You've got the traditional defense contractors. They're probably not jumping for joy about this because there's a real chance they'll get shut out of some of those prototype projects that are now being set aside for NDCs. And then you've got the program managers within the DoD. Some of them, they might be more comfortable sticking with the traditional companies they know and trust, the ones with the proven track records, rather than taking a chance on these newer, less established NDCs. And then there's Congress, the folks who hold the purse strings. They might be a little hesitant to worried about the risks of putting too much faith in companies that haven't really been in the defense game for that long.
Makes sense. So to really make this Section 315 work the way they envision it, it sounds like the DoD is going to need to put some resources behind it. What are we talking about here specifically?
The Forged Act points out a few key areas where they'll need to invest. First off, they'll need to actually fund these new NDC consortia, help them get up and running and cover their operating costs. Then there's training. They're going to need to make sure that their staff, especially those contracting officers and acquisition folks, are really up to speed on how to work with NDCs and how to navigate these new, more agile processes. And then, like we talked about earlier, they'll probably need to hire more people to handle all the extra work of overseeing these consortia and making sure everything is running according to the new rules.
So, funding, training, staffing sounds like a pretty standard government initiative, but how are they actually going to know if all this effort is actually paying off? How will they measure success?
They've laid out some pretty specific measures of success, and again, these are from the reviewer. One of the big ones is the number of prototype awards that go to non-traditional defense contractors. They're adding for a 20% increase there. Another one is how quickly they're able to get new capabilities out in the field. They want to be 25% faster than they were before. And then, of course, there's the overall success rate of the projects that these consortia take on. They're hoping for a 90% success rate or higher. They're planning to track all of this through the DoD's existing data collection systems once this whole thing gets implemented.
Sounds like they've put a lot of thought into how to actually track whether this is working or not. But, just playing devil's advocate here, are there any other ways they could achieve the same goals, getting more innovation and bringing in those non-traditional companies without having to go through all the trouble of setting up these new consortia?
Yeah, they do mention a couple of potential alternative approaches in the Act. One idea is to just broaden the scope of the existing commercial solutions openings, make them more NDC friendly without having to create a whole new system of consortia. That could give them a bit more flexibility and maybe cut down on some of the administrative burden. And another option, one that's been talked about in places like innovation.defense.gov, is to go for a kind of hybrid model. That would mean having projects, maybe even consortia, that include both traditional and non-traditional companies working together. That way, you'd get the benefit of the NDC's fresh thinking and the traditional company's experience and know-how all in one package.
I see. So some different paths they could have taken, but they landed on these dedicated NDC consortia. All right, so wrapping things up here, what have we learned from this deep dive into Section 315 of the Forged Act?
Well, the big takeaway is that the DAD is really serious about injecting more innovation into their work, and they're putting their money where their mouth is with these NDC consortia. They want to use those more flexible OT agreements and faster acquisition pathways to get those cutting-edge commercial technologies into the hands of the warfighter as quickly as possible.
That's a good summary. And we talked about some of the potential downsides, like potentially shutting out the traditional companies and the need to manage all of this effectively. But the Act does lay out some potential solutions for those concerns. And they've even given us some ways to measure whether this whole thing is actually successful. And before we go, one last thing for our listeners to ponder. With this big push to bring in non-traditional contractors, what does that mean for the bigger picture of innovation in the defense world? What new opportunities might pop up, and what challenges might people need to be ready for? How can individuals and organizations position themselves to either contribute to this new landscape or navigate it successfully? It's definitely something to think about as these recommendations, potentially become reality.
Absolutely. And remember, this is just one piece of the Forged Act puzzle. There's a lot more to explore.
Exactly. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and make sure to check out the other episodes in this series as we continue to unpack the Forged Act. Until next time.
See you then.